Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm always honored to stand here in the well of the House. Today is no exception. I love my country, but I'm not proud of my president. Mr. Speaker, I'm saddened to say that the level of discourse in our country has been brought to an all-time low. There are people who were very much concerned when the president indicated that there would be a ban on persons from certain countries, ban on Muslims, if you will. There were people who were saddened when they learned that the president was of the opinion that members of the LGBTQ community could not serve in the military. There were people who were saddened by the president's comments about SOBs playing football. Others were disheartened by the president's comment with reference to Charlottesville and some very fine people being among the racists, the bigots, the KKK. But Mr. Speaker, the latest commentary has really caused an international uproar. People around the world cannot believe that the president has made his latest comments. Mr. Speaker, these comments are words that are hurtful and harmful, but this is just not another person making these comments. This is the President of the United States of America. And the President of the United States of America has the ability, the power, and the wherewithal to do more than simply speak these words. These words can be converted into policy of the United States of America. The Muslim ban comments, there was an attempt, and it's still going on, to ban Muslims, persons from certain countries. The comments about Charlottesville were encouraging persons who were there, many of whom were interacting with persons of color, minorities, Jewish people, on their jobs and in other places. It encouraged them to continue to do these dastardly things that they do and had in mind when they were saying, Jews will not replace us. The comments that were made about the S-hole or S-house, the kind of profanity that ought not emanate from the presidency, those comments were made as there was an effort afoot to deal with immigration, to draft an immigration policy. The president can put his comments into policy. The president can drive policy with these ugly comments. The president's comments are not only hurtful when you hear them, they are hurtful to people who have to suffer when they become policy. I refuse to accept what the president is doing, and I refuse to accept it because if you will tolerate something, you will not change it. You will do little to change it. I'm going to do everything that I can to change it, and it is within my power as a member of the Congress of the United States of America to bring articles of impeachment against this president for what he has done. I have done it before. I will do it again and again and again. I will not allow it to happen unchallenged. I know that there are many who would say that this is not appropriate, but I can only say this. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, since we are just now removed 1 or 2 days from Dr. King's celebration. We're still celebrating in my neck of the woods. But injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And if we allow this injustice to persist, what is happening and said in the White House is going to impact every house in this country. We must take a stand against this president and his bigoted comments. I yield back the balance of my time.
So members are reminded